Hello, everyone. I'm Mark DeYmaz, founding pastor of the Mosaix Church of Central Arkansas here in Little Rock, the co-founder of the Mosaix Global Network with my good friend, Dr. George Yancey, and in this capacity, here as the Multiethnic Next Director for Exponential Next, working with that wonderful organization here in 2026, recording some podcasts, particularly focused on planting, growing, and developing healthy multi-ethnic churches. And I've got a wonderful panel, good friends, on with me today, talking about in this episode cultural intelligence. You know, in my first book, I wrote about building in terms of 7 core commitments of building a healthy multi-ethnic church. Among those was being intentional, taking intentional steps, developing cross-cultural relationships, and pursuing cross-cultural competence. And all 3 of those core commitments are built into our conversation about cultural intelligence, CQ, as we call it today, why, how, and what of it. And that's what we're talking about. So I've got some great friends, really people with expertise in this space. And let's take a moment, y'all go around if you would. Harry, maybe start with you and just go around and give us an introduction of yourself.
Okay, thanks, Mark. It's great to be here. Harry Lee, I've been working with Mark for 23 years at Mosaix. I'm now the senior pastor here at the church. And I'm also the director of cultural intelligence for Mosaix's Global Network.
Great. Graham?
Hi, everyone. My name is Graham McKeague, and I work very closely for the last few years with Harry in particular in offering CQ for churches, denominations, and really thinking about the connection application of CQ for ministry leaders. I'm originally from Northern Ireland and came over to the United States after college to do some global missions training, and really started to think a lot about intercultural ministry at that point, and have since moved to Grand Rapids, Michigan area, where I've been for the last 20 years. And CQ has both been a personal journey for me as well as a ministry journey, and excited to share more.
Yeah, that's great. Graham, I'm glad you said that, because I would think you pronounce your name McKeague, but you said McKeague, and I figured, oh, there must be an Irish thing in there, right? And all that. So that's really cool. Of course, my name gets butchered all the time. So anyway, I know that. Marcus, tell us about you.
Yeah, sure. Marcus Lloyd. I live in the Dallas area, and I get to lead a ministry called Threaded. And it's a biblical racial reconciliation and justice ministry. Background, I've been in ministry for about 20 years. And lately, over the past 10, 12 years, has been a focus really on diversity, equity, and inclusion, intercultural studies, studying at Yale and Fuller Theological Seminary, just trying to figure out what it looks like for the church to be ready for this conversation that is already upon us. So excited to talk about CQ today.
Yeah, and Jaye, that's a great transition to you and your role there at Pepperdine. So tell us about yourself.
Hi there, my name is Jaye Goosby Smith, and I'm a former business professor. Currently, I'm a consultant in the areas of diversity and inclusion, which is why I love CQ so much. And also I serve as Vice President for Community Belonging and Chief Diversity Officer at Pepperdine. And simultaneously, I serve as an assistant minister at an AME church in Santa Monica, California.
Well, thanks all of you for making time to talk about this important conversation, cultural intelligence, CQ. And before you click a button off, if you're watching or listening here, when we're talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, we are talking about biblical themes. This is what Christ is all about. He came and stretched his arms to hold Republicans and Democrats together, blacks, whites, Asians, Hispanics, rich, poor. He died to create a healthy tension. He is lifted up to draw all people, not just some people, to himself. And diversity, equity, inclusion, of course, there's the world's definition of that. There's some people that don't want anything to do with that, but we are here talking about the biblical roots of why cultural intelligence is important to advance the gospel, the credibility of the church, and particularly here in the United States with an increasingly diverse, painfully polarized, and often cynical society. So very biblically grounded, all for the sake of the gospel. Harry and Graham, let me start with both of you, because Graham, of course, you studied with our good friend Dave Livermore, who developed the CQ Center almost 25 years ago, and Harry as well, you know. So Harry, why don't you start, and then Graham, just give us an understanding of the concept of cultural intelligence, not so much CQ in terms of the performance and the outcomes of it, but just generally speaking from your perspective, what are we talking about when we're talking about cultural intelligence?
Yeah, you know, we always say you've heard of IQ, which measures your intelligence, and then there's EQ, which we talk about emotional intelligence. But CQ is all about your ability to understand people that are not like you. And I like to talk about how when we first started Mosaix, how we had no language. We didn't even have concepts on how to describe what we were trying to do. And when we discovered CQ in 2013, it's almost like all the lights went on, because all the things that we felt and were trying to articulate and define was all encapsulated within this whole framework called the CQ model. And so it's been a great way for us just to improve our effectiveness, actually help others to have the same vernacular, use the same framework and models to help everybody kind of move forward on this on the same page.
Yeah, so if you're listening or watching today, we're talking about the same thing, but kind of in two different aspects: cultural intelligence as a concept, as an understanding in building healthy multi-ethnic churches, developing those healthy cross-cultural relationships and pursuing cross-cultural competence. And then what Harry's leaning into as well. And Graham, pick it up here, because I know you've been with Dave Livermore for many, many years. There's actually a structural way, an assessment and training that we offer through Mosaix, threaded as well, and over at Pepperdine with Jaye. But talk to us about your background in terms of Dave, and maybe why he got into the field, why you got into the field, and what that means for you and for us today.
Yeah, absolutely. So the roots of CQ go back to the very, very late 1990s, early 2000s. And it actually goes back to right around the time of Y2K, for those who would remember that. And it was an interesting time because you had a global problem, and you had people from all over the world working on these global multi-ethnic, multinational teams trying to solve the same problem. And what they find is people were really struggling not on the technical sides of solving that problem, but on the interpersonal side. So communication challenges, decision-making challenges, and so on and on it went. So the original research problem behind CQ is what makes some people more effective at working with people across cultures than others. And they really wanted to identify, are there certain practices or capabilities that if you really leaned into those and developed those over time, would make you more effective at working with people from different cultures. And so the research identified 4 different areas. So it's CQ Drive, which is looking at your motivation and level of persistence in working with people across cultures. The second is CQ Knowledge, which is looking at the ways that cultures are both the same and different from each other. CQ Strategy is the third piece, which is how do you take the knowledge and the motivation that you have in place? How do you think strategically, plan ahead, and how would you develop self-awareness as you work with others across cultures? And then finally, CQ Action, which is where you are intentionally and consciously adapting your communication and behavior in order to be more effective as you relate with others. And so, Mark, as you also mentioned, there's now a very robust assessment tool was created, and we have used that in Mosaix with many church leaders, denominational leaders, higher education leaders to help measure their effectiveness on those 4 areas, those 4 capabilities. So it's been really fun to see that tool put into practice. And one of the other aspects of CQ that's very powerful, it is a very robust tool. It has been highly researched, highly tested. And when you see it in practice, you just feel the weight of that research and the validity, the reliability that comes with that whenever you're wanting to put it into practice.
Yeah, the great thing about the assessment, of course, and the tools that have been developed by Dave Livermore, his team at the Cultural Intelligence Center, is we're not fixed, right? It's almost like a map in the airport. You are here. So going through assessment, understanding these things as a collective church as well as individually, you're able to identify, here's where we are, here's what's going well, here's some areas for improvement, and chart a course to continue to make progress in this area. Jaye, in terms of cultural intelligence as a general concept, as you well know, it is super important for us in our country, certainly today, to learn to interact in a positive and a healthy way with those who maybe have a different lived experience than us at an individual level, but also collectively in a school like Pepperdine, where you have a lot of diversity amongst the faculty, amongst the students, and of course, looking ahead, we're thinking about churches that we are all trying to build, healthy, multi-ethnic and multicultural churches for the sake of the gospel. What's been your understanding of cultural intelligence, and how are you leaning into that, both personally as well as in your role there at Pepperdine?
So I think cultural intelligence is extremely important. We all grow up with a set of assumptions and taken for granted that accompany us everywhere we go. And so I think that as we go into different scenarios and as different aspects of the university become more and more diverse, people from different cultures, generations, countries, things of that nature, it's really important to look at kind of the building blocks of what some of those assumptions are made of. Additionally, as a minister, one of the things that we are doing is trying to bloom where we're planted. So as populations shift and the churches are where they are and the population around you shifts, cultural intelligence becomes critically important as well, as you no longer have your congregation having the same assumptions and take it for granted. And you've got to kind of have some way to systematically look at yourself, your culture and assumptions, and those of the neighborhoods that are surrounding you.
Yeah, when you're talking, I think about the United Methodist Church, for instance, a wonderful organization, been around forever. But of course, their strategy really from the beginning, but more in the last 50, 60 years, of course, was planting churches in neighborhoods. And then these buildings exist, these churches exist. And then over 30, 40, 50 years, that neighborhood changes. Yes. And the people that used to live there no longer live there. And then potentially, if you're not adapting, if you're not changing, if you're not developing this pursuit of cross-cultural competence or intelligence, you're kind of out of sync with that. And I often tell pastors, you can play for today or position for tomorrow. And of course, with the continued and ongoing diversity of our country, all of us as pastors and ministry leaders, both individually and collectively, should be making these shifts so that we will be able to speak with confidence and credibility to people that grew up with a very different lived experience than we did, in a humble way, in a listening way, in an understanding and an empathetic way. As again, we're trying to draw all people, not just some, to Christ and to his church. So Marcus, I know you're working with a lot of churches and your work with Threaded, very much like Mosaix. When you are interacting with churches, let's talk about kind of what you're seeing on the negative side, if you will. When you're coming into a church, what are you finding where they maybe haven't, these leaders, the church has an aspirational heart, but maybe they haven't really pursued this with intelligence or intentionality? And then show us how cultural intelligence and leaning into that can actually move both individual hearts of the leaders as well as the collective church.
Yeah, it's interesting. I had a friend tell me once that everybody likes the idea of diversity until they come in contact with the diversity of ideas, right? And so you come into churches where I think, intellectually and verbally, they want to articulate, and we want a diverse church. We want a multi-ethnic church. And what we've seen, and you know this, Mark, for the last 25 years, this first quarter of this 100-year movement here, like people have been creating multi-ethnic church, people who look different come to the church. But what really kind of moves the needle is if you're moving into the church becomes more multicultural, where the beautiful aspects of the culture are actually starting to pour into how the church is doing and doing the things that it's doing. Now, that's the place that really makes people really uncomfortable, because people like the idea, again, of if I can have a predominantly black church, if I can have a predominantly white church culture, and they get to stay in that culture, but I have people who look different, I can do that because ultimately the culture is still staying the same. But once you push on him like, hey, but the people who are coming here are assimilating to your culture, they're not getting to kind of bring the culture out. Now it becomes more difficult because people don't want to give up their cultural comforts. And so what I think happens is we get into this place where we believe and we've been told that coming to church is about my comfort. And when you start to get into this work of crossing cultural lines, like the uncomfortability is actually the thing that should become comfortable to you. And it should be the thing you should be shooting for. And here's what I say, and Mark, you've said it before, right? Like the arc of the church leans towards a multicultural, multi-ethnic experience, right? That Revelation 7:9, all tribes and tongues and languages, you got it on your sweatshirt right there, right? That picture is not just of what God puts in that mode there. It's not just a picture of what church could be. It's what church should be, right? And so there's something intentional that God is trying to do. There's something beneficial, if you will, to that iteration of church that we haven't caught the vision of yet. And what I think is, and we talk about it in Threaded, like, and even thinking about it in terms of like a puzzle, like we're all walking around with this piece of the puzzle and we're saying, this is what life is like. But we don't recognize that we're actually a piece of a larger puzzle, which is the image of God. And we all are supposed to be bringing our pieces. And what happens is as soon as we connect with other pieces, we actually experience more of God. And so that's the place that I'm always trying to push people to. But it still becomes really the fear is like, okay, if I make this move, like all the people who want to be comfortable will leave, right? And so you have to start recognizing that this work actually, it comes with a cost to some extent, but the opportunity cost, if you will, is better than the cost of this short term. And Mark, you said it again, like you can keep playing for today and keeping everybody happy, but then you're just managing decline in a church, right? Mark, you said that before. There's an opportunity for us to actually like not only experience growth in the big C church because of all the diversity, but a growth in like who we are as Christians as well. So I'm always trying to push that in the church. And I think people intellectually understand that. And even sort of in the spiritual prose, they're like, yes, that sounds amazing. But as soon as you start actually working on it, like all of a sudden it's hard to invest in, both with time and money.
Yeah, that's such a good point when you talk about the cost that's involved in planting, growing, and developing healthy multi-ethnic churches. As we all know, planting a church has an intrinsic set of problems, and whether it's rural, whether it's inner city, whether it's Black, white, Asian, Hispanic, multi-ethnic, all church plants have an intrinsic set of problems. But when you're pursuing this heaven on earth vision, multi-ethnic church, if you will, it comes with an additional set, an entirely additional set of landmines that have to be navigated. And of course, cultural intelligence is a pathway to help us navigate, to work smart, not hard, and to find increasing credibility and competence in engaging people who are not like us in one way or another. Of course, you brought up like humanity. We're all created in the image of God, and the aspirational hopes. I was talking to researcher Eunice Hong yesterday, who shared a story of a older white woman who verbally talked about she wants to love all people, love my neighbor as myself, etc. But then began, because of that, going to a multi-ethnic church. But not long after that, I believe it was a daughter or a late teenager, early 20s, if I heard the story right, her daughter came home with a person of color, right? And all of a sudden, she's like, whoa, wait a second. I don't know if I signed up for that. But in her case, a good heart leaning in as a learner with humility, she got beyond that kind of that human response or reaction in the moment, and over time built a wonderful relationship with someone not like her, and is still in that church today. So that's a wonderful story and trajectory of somebody leaning in. But of course, it's not always like that. You know, it dawned on me that because, Graham, you brought up drive, knowledge, strategy, and action. That's a good framework for the rest of our time together. Why don't we lean into drive? And all of this, even what Marcus was talking about here just a moment ago, has to do with our motivations. And I suppose there's a lot of motivations for this, right, Graham? There's a lot of reasons that somebody might want to lean into cultural intelligence. But some of those are performative, and they're not necessarily the ones that you'd really want to see in terms of our relationship with Christ. But talk to us about the area of drive, if you will. What should motivate us? What often does motivate us? And how do we improve our drive in this space?
Yeah, I love talking about drive. I love talking about that motivational piece. And what's really interesting from the data that we see with working with church leaders, denominational leaders, is you have that combination of intrinsic or internal motivation as well as extrinsic or external motivation. And we really see both of those aspects show up in the assessment reports generated by the CQ Center. And it's really fascinating to unpack those two aspects, the internal and the external, with church leaders. And so I think in a lot of cases, people think primarily in terms of building their internal motivation and seeing that as like the pure motivation for doing this work, right? And that's a motivation where you just absolutely love to do multi-ethnic ministry. You just get it. Like, you're so driven by the passion of it. But that's not where everybody's motivation is. And you see that show up in the data. Some people are driven by the benefits that they see to themselves, to their church, to their community, to the kingdom at large. That's what motivates them, is that broader sense of this is the way it should be, even if they're not internally waking up every day passionate to do that work. If at the start they're not passionate, they often become more passionate as they lean into it. And so we will address both of those areas of motivation in the training that we do. And Harry has seen this a great deal as well. And we can really speak to those quite precisely. And whether that's asking for the Spirit to move in people's hearts, to really stir them to action and to see in Scripture the vision for a multi-ethnic church, or whether it's some other form of being in community together where people are pushing themselves to grow in their motivation, or maybe it's their heart is moved by something they see in their community or in the national news media, where they say that is not right. There's got to be something different. There's got to be a way that's kingdom oriented to see justice happen, for example. So we will really sit with leaders and have them examine their motivation. And it's actually a really critical distinction for cultural intelligence. We don't just jump in and say, hey, we've got to learn a few things about X or Y or Z community. We actually do a lot of self-examination and motivation first, which is something I love about CQ.
Yeah, when we're talking about motivations and drive, of course, we're talking about a leader's motivation and drive, hopefully from a biblical perspective for the sake of the gospel. But Jaye, I'm sure you as an African-American woman and in your position at Pepperdine and through the years, I think about the motivations from the other side. I bet your motivations probably have been questioned. I'm just guessing. That somehow, you're just being politically correct, or as the phrase is, woke. And what's that not only feel like when that's not really why you're doing this, but I imagine motivations are often questioned in your world. And how do you help people get beyond maybe that, or how do you handle that in your position at Pepperdine?
So one of the things that caused me to go into this role at Pepperdine is that it equally uses my PhD in organizational behavior and my Master of Divinity, my seminary education. Pepperdine is a Christian university, explicitly so. And so when I started the department, I came up with a biblically sound vision for our department, the acronym of which is DeYmaz, where CQ fits into that. Each letter stands for something. D is for dialogue. Where CQ fits into my vision for that is under mindfulness, because things like CQ drive, things like your motivation, things like your awareness of your own assumption and awareness of others falls into the realm of mindfulness. And so that's where CQ is addressed. As far as the naysayers, initially when the position was posted, I distinctly remember someone on a Facebook page commented, "Keep Pepperdine Christian." Well, that's kind of easy to do when you have a biblical rationale that's grounded in the Bible. And so when we do have people that ask about how we're reacting to all of the current things that are going on, I pretty much tell them we're tethered to our university's Christian mission and to the Bible. And until those two things change, our work hasn't changed at all. So the way that I have dealt with it has been grounding the work that I do such that it's biblically sound. And so I don't really have that many internal challenges. There are always people who are challenging, who make assumptions based upon what I look like, and they think they know what I think. But that's really their problem, not mine.
Yeah, and or perhaps your title with DEI in that. I imagine some people just see the title.
And my title is Vice President for Community Belonging. That's my university role. And my second role is Chief Diversity Officer. And so what I do is break down the acronym of diversity, fairness, inclusion, and belonging. And fairness is a combination of equality and equity. So I do a lot of education, and CQ is now in my arsenal since I got certified.
Yeah. Well, that's wonderful. And I love how you are overcoming those challenges and helping people understand through the mission statement, as well as your own work, your pastoral work, your MDiv, that this is a biblical vision. This didn't start in the United States or anywhere else. This has started at the heart of God at the very beginning, and certainly through Abram and on we could go. Marcus, when you think about improving the drive of churches you're working with or leaders, what are you saying to them? What are you doing beyond the assessment and all that? But what's one or two things, if people are listening and watching, they're planters, they're pastors, they're wanting to lean into this. But as we're talking about here, it all begins with your motivations, your biblical calling and why, and understanding. I think theology is super important to that, even as Jaye was talking about. But what's one or two ways you help leaders or collective churches develop or improve their drive?
Yeah, I think we've talked a little bit about them already. I think I love, Graham's talking about the intrinsic and extrinsic sort of motivations, right? The internal, I mentioned even before, like to engage in this work and to engage cross-culturally is an opportunity to know God more, right? Like if that's the motivation of a Christian, it's like to know God more, to be able to see him and have the ability to see him through another's eyes, right? Like I can't look through someone who is Korean and see the ways in which God has strategically and particularly engage that particular group of people. I can't do that unless I have somebody with me who is Korean that can give me that. And I think that that's really one of the beautiful things. Reading the Bible cross-culturally just completely opens up all kinds of things contextually for the Bible and ways to think about it. I mean, you talk about just the story of Moses and the ways in which it's preached in a predominantly white church, or preached in a black church, preached in a Hispanic church. There's just different angles that you go, oh my gosh, I didn't know it had all that going on with it. So intrinsically first, like I just get to know more of God, know more about the scripture. Extrinsically, I think just it from a benefit standpoint, we've already know like that in a few years, like it's the browning of America, right? More a majority minority space. Like you're going to be in a more diverse space. In fact, those who are under 20 are already there. For those who have been called to take the gospel to all, disciple people from all tribes, tongues, and nations, right? Like we actually have those nations coming to us, right? Again, I go back to the Revelation 7:9 picture. Like that picture is possible to experience in your neighborhood, right? In your backyard, in so many places, right? And that in and of itself is a really incredible thing. And it opens up two things. It's like, first, if I want that, I recognize that there's a barrier between actually engaging those folks. Like most people, when I'm talking to them, they're like, okay, I get this. I don't know how to engage them. Well, CQ is a great thing because it helps you to actually engage people who are different than you in your neighborhood. So your evangelism, if you will, becomes more diverse. You become more skilled at it because you can think about it in terms of how do I actually approach somebody who is a different culture in a way that they can hear me. But also there's a way in which we try to teach it in the ways we do CQ of like, think about the meta narrative or the strong narrative that's in that culture and how that connects to, and how Jesus connects to that, right? So the more culturally intelligent you become, both in the ways that you do it pragmatically, but also biblically and spiritually, evangelistically, the more successful you're going to be able to engage your neighbors. And if I can put it in very just capitalistic terms, the greater possibility that your church survives in that area, right? Like that it just survives. So those are the things that I'm usually kind of putting in front of folks.
Yeah, I think thriving is a big part of that. And if you're going to have any measure of credibility with an increasingly diverse society, you better, as a pastor, as a person, and your staff, et cetera, your team, gain cultural intelligence now in order to be positioned for the future. As you mentioned, the browning of America, already 1 in 2 Gen Z is non-white, 43% of millennials non-white. According to the latest research, 2042, 1 in 2 people non-white. And so it is the trajectory for all of us going forward. And you're talking about teaching and understanding this game. That takes us to the second aspect of CQ. Harry, why don't you share with us about that knowledge? Because obviously, we can have aspirational hopes. We can see with our eyes and understand that there are changing demographics. We can look into the Old Testament to the New Testament, God's heart for all people. Healthy multi-ethnic church is the standard of the New Testament. So in the drive, those could motivate us, but we have to understand something if we're going to, in a sense, be efficient and effective with our time and gain ground, work smart, not hard. And so that takes us to that realm of knowledge. Harry, talk to us about knowledge and the intentionality of gaining that, what is contained in that bucket, if you will, and how do we improve it?
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting, as we've helped so many different churches and organizations, knowledge is usually a pretty low score. And a lot of times it's tied to the drive score, because if you have low drive, you'll have low knowledge. And so as you think about what is it that somebody needs to know and how do they go about pursuing it, what I always tell them is the good thing is if your score is low in knowledge, it's the easiest to fix, because you can always read a book, you can watch videos, you can listen to podcasts, you can, intentionally get to know somebody and just know which kind of questions to ask, which makes it so much more enriching if you are pursuing cross-cultural relationship. But for a lot of churches, you have to begin that conversation with what don't you know about the people around you? Because a lot of times people aren't even aware. I get this a lot that, I don't think we need it yet because where we are, there's not a whole lot of diversity. And the very first place I have them go is, of course, the websites that show who's living around the church. And it begins with knowing who's around you, and then knowing what does that mean, and how do we begin reaching them? How do we get to know who they are? How do we begin serving and loving our neighbors? And that's a very deep question. You know, the knowledge part, to increase your knowledge up here, is very quick and relatively easy, but the aspect of actually learning how that knowledge turns into action, which I'm assuming we'll get to, is the hard part. But it is important, because it's like, you know, Solomon said, knowledge is the beginning of wisdom. So you got to start somewhere, and it's a great place to start because it's relatively easy to gain knowledge.
Yeah, and even when you think about those of you listening, watching, planting, growing, developing, leaning into healthy multi-ethnic church and ministry, one of the knowledge pieces, as Harry alluded to, is there's a website. Harry, I want you to give it in a second, but often I find church planters, the first place they go is Google, or now some type of generative AI, and they get the demographics of the community they want to plant in, or the church that they're in. And those demographics are actually, in one sense, lag measures, because they're based on the census. And so you get, 60% here, 30%, 40, 25, whatever, in these different demographic categories. And that's all well and good. But one of the things that we should understand in the knowledge realm, as we gain the understanding that Harry's talking about, is there's more people that are doing life in a community than may actually live in the community. And the idea, if you're planning a church particularly, don't just rely on the census data, but we're looking into the people who are doing life in that community, who mows the yards, who works in the fast food industry, who is in the hotel industry, and many other things that we might not otherwise imagine when we just take it down to a quantitative 40% or this, 30% or that, 20%. It's also people crossing these invisible barriers, if you will, fences that exist in different cities they're doing life there. They're earning money. And we've always said here in our church that, people cross invisible lines, if you will, for economic incentive. They will certainly cross those lines for the incentive of love. And that's what our church has tried to provide for them. Harry, what's that website when you steer people to the demographics beyond just the census data of communities? That would be a good piece for people watching to lean into and learn about their own community.
Yeah, the website is called arcgis.com. It's ARCGIS.com. It's not the most user-friendly website, by the way. But once you can get it set up, it's incredibly effective. And one thing that's really interesting about the demographic part is very rarely do I find any community less than 15% non-white. It usually starts there and it goes way up from there, depending on where you are. But even the people who are in rural Washington are now living there's whole sections of that state that are minority majority, largely because of all the Hispanic immigration that's happened into that part of the state. So, for people to say we don't think we have a lot of diversity, they need to look that stuff up. That's the stuff they need to know, because it's there, and it should be very eye-opening for some.
Well, let's stay with you real quick and open up the topic of strategy, right? We talked about drive, the internal, extrinsic, external motivations. We talked a bit about knowledge. But Harry, briefly open up, because I want to get everybody else's take, of course, but on strategy. So I've got this drive. I understand what it is, the biblical moorings of this vision to engage all people, not just some, for Christ, both individually, collectively. And I want to gain some knowledge through personal relationships and pursuing cross-cultural competence. But you're leaning in, then you mentioned action, but before that is a strategy, right? What does that involve when we develop a strategy, both personally and collectively? Where do we start with that?
Yeah, this is the one that I think, Graham, I love the way Graham talks about it, because he says this is the metacognitive part of CQ. It's the part where you're actually thinking about thinking. And I love that description, because it really helps you to begin having a playbook. If you have this knowledge and you're trying to get to an action, the strategy piece is somewhere in between those two. We're actually thinking about it and strategizing around it in very effective ways. And the way it shows itself practically, especially, is if you're meeting with people not like yourself, there's an aspect called planning where you're actually thinking about talking with others, planning what this interaction is going to be like before you ever have it. And you can have it, it can help so much with just a little bit of planning in that part. And so the strategy piece is really, Graham calls it the secret sauce of the CQ assessment, because it's such a critical piece in connecting what you know to how you actually serve.
Yeah, Grammy's mentioned you. Take it away from there. What's your take on strategy? It's obviously a passion for you in terms of those 4 buckets.
Yeah, the strategy piece is so critical because one of the things that the research shows is if you just have some cultural knowledge, but you don't have strategy, you're actually in a worse off position than if you didn't know anything at all. And so you can become quite dangerous if you have some knowledge without strategy. To Harry's, just to put a more definition even on Harry's point about planning, which is a really important one. An example of that would be in CQ knowledge, you learn about cultural values. These are ways in which the cultures that we find ourselves in operate below the surface, as it were. These are often hidden patterns of thinking and behaving that we don't always talk about, but we all follow. You know, these patterns of living and thinking and interacting with each other. And a good example would be a cultural value called power distance, which has to do with how do you relate to people who are in authority over you and the people that you're in authority over. And this would be critical if you are forming a team, if you're church planting, if you're part of a denomination, you're trying to get buy-in for what you're trying to do. How do you relate to the people who are in those leadership positions above you? If you're trying to network or build bridges in a community, especially if you're a Caucasian church and you are used to a very flat organizational structure where you call everybody by their first name. When you are meeting with an African-American church, if you walk into the door and you use a first name for the pastor or the bishop, you're likely to run into problems, right? And so this would be a great example of taking knowledge about power distance and roles and the importance of titles by cultural group, and you plan ahead. So I'm going to meet with an African-American pastor or a bishop. You could plan ahead and say, when I greet that person, how should I greet them? What should I say to them? That's a great example of using strategy in order to be effective, to not cause offense to people, and to really be able to adjust your behavior as you are in these critical relationships that you're building.
Yeah, that's I think at the root of CQ, that's what it is, right? To be able to interact effectively with people in a welcoming way, in a belonging and an understanding way, in a way that's humble. And we take that knowledge and drive and turn it into strategy. Jaye and Marcus, I want you both to speak into that. Jaye, why don't we start with you? Helping people to strategize, plan to plan, if you will, not only is important, but more specifically, if you're talking to church planters and pastors here, how would you help them or talk to them about applying their drive and knowledge in strategic ways, plan to plan, if you will, to build a healthy multi-ethnic church?
One of the things I'd go back to before talking about the strategy is the knowledge and looking at culture as more than just faces, pigments, or racial designations on a census. Because, for example, Colin Woodard had a book about the 11 different national regional cultures within the U.S. So you might have a church that is all white, but people are from different regions. Well, you peel the onion a little bit more, and families have their own cultures and have differences within those values. And so there's always a usefulness for CQ. And when you start to understand CQ better, you can see those different dimensions of assumptions of people, even people who are supposedly the same because they look the same or they're the same race or whatever. So strategically, I usually think about different things. I was laughing about the power distance comment because you're just spot on. And that's one of the things with integrating as environments that were predominantly Black become predominantly white. Sometimes you'll have visitors and they will address people in different ways because they don't have that CQ strategy. They haven't done any research on where they're going into. They haven't listened, for example, to maybe people address others, to see how they address each other. And also part of that knowledge part that's so important as well is that understanding of the history and the social issues that have occurred to understand that community. So I think one of the things I want to do at my school is to make CQ mandatory for students going to study abroad. Because we take students abroad, lots of our students study abroad, but without having this CQ base, they're just being American, plunking themselves around, stumbling around, oftentimes being American. And when you go to other countries, you realize how we're perceived sometimes, and that's not how we want to be perceived. And so I'm really trying to push to get our international programs to support cultural intelligence as a strategy for helping our students soak up as much as possible. And also, for going and doing international service, you have to know who you're serving. Otherwise, you're serving at them versus serving with them.
Yeah, such great wisdom and all the things you said, taking us back on the knowledge side as well as strategy. Such a simple step. And as we talked about, all it's doing, all that assessment is giving not only understanding just by going through the assessment and some measure of training, but at the same time, we're not fixed, right? It's like, again, the airport map. You are here. Where are we? What do I got going for me? How am I doing so far in a positive way? What are some things lacking? And then pointing us ahead to growth in that regard. Marcus, when you're taking the drive and the knowledge, working with individuals, collective groups of staff or pastors, I know one size doesn't fit all, of course, but do you have kind of a way that you go about of helping turn the corner from mere drive and knowledge to some simple steps towards strategy for pastors and churches?
Strategy is such an interesting one for me, because I can't divorce it as much as even what Jay was saying. Like I constantly, what we're talking about here is a discipleship strategy, right? And when we start to think about going and engaging these things, it has to be really clear, right, that you got the right motivation. But there's something in the strategy too, and this is where I think when I'm dealing with churches, a lot of times they believe themselves to be multi-ethnic churches, and what I like to say to them is utilize the diversity of your church to help you even create a strategy to engage the diversity of your neighborhood. Right? There's plenty of churches who are kind of, whether they're predominantly whatever, most churches have some kind of diversity within it. And the people who are there, who are not a part of the majority culture, they still have some access to the culture that they are not engaging with on that Sunday. They have learned how to assimilate into your space, but they have the potential is they have some sort of connection. Utilizing what you already have to help you even create the strategy is going to be really important. But I also think about humility of engaging the diversity that's around you that may not even be in your church. I know they talk about third spaces, right? So the gym is one of my third spaces. I've got this wonderful Muslim woman who works out with me, and she's of course fully like garbed and that kind of stuff. And I when I first started there, people were like hugging her and giving her, high fives and all these things. And I remember coming to her once, I'm like, is that how we're supposed to be engaging you? She goes, no, this is not how we do it. Like, I'm not supposed to be hugging nobody. I'm not even supposed to be high-fiving. I was like, oh my gosh, that's so helpful, right? Like, and so it was like, great. Like I learned, but I had to humble myself and go, is that how that works? And she taught me something, gave me knowledge. And just the other day, I was like, hey, I'm about to go into this community, this Islamic community. Now, what would be the wrong things to do, right? And she just started articulating different things, what would be helpful. And I was like, man, that's super helpful. So even the thinking about the thinking comes with relational knowledge building amongst people who are a part of the group that you have. And again, that's not somebody who's at my church. This is somebody who's a different religion. They're just a part of whatever. So again, I go to the fact that in most cases, and I think, Harry, you articulated, most people have more diversity around them than they realize. And even in your engagements, there's more diversity. And so part of the strategy is just actually humbling yourself to learn to learn how to go into that environment from people who represent that environment. I'll give you one quick story just to go with Graham. Like I've been brought into multiple churches to be the first person of color they've ever hired, right? And I come in there and I'm working cultural stuff. At the last church, I mean, we wanted to build a sister relationship with the Black church down the street. And we had set up a lunch like, hey, we're going to get this this church is going to come to lunch with us. And I had to sit the whole staff down. I had to talk my pastor to this. I said, hey, before we do this, I need a word with the staff, like a couple of days before. What do you mean? I like, trust me. And I had to sit down and do what you talk about, Grandma. Hey, here's what's happening. When you walk in, when they come in here, do not call them by their first name. If you don't know if they're a person, a pastor, just say Mr., Mrs., brother. Like, don't call them their names. Don't do that. And when they were talking about, hey, we're going to serve food, I said, please do not serve them fried chicken. Do not do that. Like, they're not coming here trying to get, like, they already know that's what they're expecting. If you serve them tacos, like, they're going to be like, oh, the church is cool. They hadn't done the thing. So, but it took an insider to sort of help with that, build the strategy. And it took a session to sit down and be humble enough to be taught by somebody outside of your culture about another culture. And I will tell you, it was not received well by everybody. There were plenty of people who were like, well, I'm just going to treat them. I just treat everybody like this, like I'm going to treat myself. And I'm going to be nice to them. I'm going to love them the way I love everybody. It's like, that's the way you love people. It's not the way everybody feels love. Just like the woman in my gym. Hey, the American thing is, oh, we're going to hug everybody. She's like, that's not how I feel loved. I actually feel offended that way. So strategically, the only thing I'm thinking of with when I'm talking to churches is like, man, continue to utilize the diversity around you to learn what that looks like. Because what you read on paper is not always going to be the thing.
Yeah, again, that humility and the understanding that there's no expert, if you will. I've been at it a while. We've all been out a while. Sometimes I'm getting introduced somewhere and the person trying to be gracious, they might say, oh, here's Mark DeYmaz. He's an expert on this. The first thing, if anybody ever says that, I always say, well, I appreciate that, but let me just explain something to you. If anybody tells you they're an expert at this stuff, do not listen to that person because we're all learners like Paul, right? All his life, he's a lifelong learner. Peter really as well. And so we're always gaining knowledge and having to learn and be humble and put ourselves in that. And I think, Jay, something that Marcus said made me think about this, that people that are having a hard time, I think that's when you talked about, Marcus, where people, they just kind of want to do their thing. They feel like, oh, I'm good. And I think that maybe comes from a couple of places. Jay, what do you think, where there's a fear of loss potentially, like I'm losing something to, like if my church is going to be more diverse, let's say, or I have to broaden myself, that somehow I'm losing something of myself rather than seeing it as something you gain. That's very typical in marriages. Maybe you come from a single parent home and the mother has a son and then he gets married. And rather than see the woman as an addition to the family, they see it as a loss that, you're taking my son away. So maybe one of the places that makes it difficult for some of those people to get on board, obviously beyond selfishness and our own humanity, maybe there's a fear of loss for people in that. But what are some of the other things that may hold people back, Jay, from your seat, from the things that Marcus is talking about when he gives us coaching, let's say, and there's a strategy, but somehow they recoil at that. Again, there's a cost involved. They feel like they're losing something. They're giving up something. You're not giving up anything. You're gaining, as again mentioned that illustration. But what do you think about that, Jay? What holds people back, I suppose, from leaning in?
I'm trying to censor, how blunt I'm going to be here.
You type it in the chat. We'll put it on.
Yeah, I'll type it in the chat. I've just got to be honest. Many times, if you find yourself, whoever you are, recoiling when someone different from you is telling you something you don't know, it's time to do introspection and see what are your prejudice, what are your biases against people in that group, because sometimes people just don't want to hear something from you. So, for example, I've gone into situations as a professor and had students react because you bring your packaging and all of you everywhere that you go. And so sometimes people are so used to thinking that you may not have something to contribute, that when you say something differently to what they actually understand, they instantly have a reaction to it. In that situation, it's a little bit deeper issue than the information you're sharing. Sometimes people react to things and reject new information based upon fear. And so I go back to the Bible verse that says, God's not given us a spirit of fear, but of power, love, and a sound mind. And so when we are experiencing fear, when our personal demise really isn't at hand, I think it's an opportunity to step back and reflect. Many of us, especially I will speak from a female perspective, have been in meetings where we've been the only female there. We've said something, people rolled over it. Somebody sitting next to us said exactly the same thing, and the people in the group heard it from that person. That happens with respect to multiple dimensions. So some people are not used to having people who are different from them be in a position of having more knowledge. Other times, we as humans, we don't like change. We don't like change. Do something like change the color of the padding on the pews in a church
Come on.
and watch people just erupt. Oh, we went from green pews to blue pews. And so some people are just uncomfortable with anything changing, and that's even relevant to CQ. And so I really think that CQ is critically important for people, period, regardless of how diverse on the surface their churches are, because diversity goes far beyond culture and race. It goes into personality, it goes into generation, it goes into how you're socialized. And so I think there are a lot of reasons why people tend to resist that information. Sometimes it's also they're insecure and they don't have the steadiest of egos, and any type of critique, regardless of what it is, just hits them and blows them out of proportion. Sometimes it's peer pressure because they've always been taught to hear a particular thing. They've been acculturated in a certain way. So there are many reasons why people experience fear, I find.
Yeah, I appreciate that on the insecurity side as well as personality, and we've often said here, and kind of, I guess, good preaching technique, 3 P words like past experience, personality, and preferences. And often we find those categories, as we're talking about, all of us here, as those things that hold people back. In fact, early on in our church, we said that no one person, including me, I'm the founder of this church, no one person, including me, their past experience, their personality, or their preferences can be allowed to dictate how we do things and how this collective culture of our church arises and develops, right? My way is a way of doing things. It is not necessarily the way of doing things. And we put that into practice here along the lines of past experience, personality, preference. But as you said, the fear, we talked about fear of loss, and rather than gaining something or feel like I've got to give up something of myself. No, you're gaining something, which is the beautiful picture of a mosaic, right? Different colors, different pieces, broken, but they come together, held and bound by the work of Jesus Christ on the cross, the Holy Spirit, to make us one for the sake of the gospel. Well, we're moving towards the end of our time together. We've got to get to that last bucket, action, right? And so I know, Harry, action is the ability to take drive, knowledge, and strategy and turn it into action. So I don't want to just talk about the category of action. I'd like to ask all of you, as you've engaged people, as you've taught and led and guided people like Sherpas up mountains on the idea of developing cross-cultural competence for all the reasons we've talked about, not just action, but how have you seen that implemented effectively? Maybe there's a story in a person's life or in a church's life, and I'd love to hear some of those stories from all of you as we think about turning drive, knowledge, and strategy into effective action, and what we could glean from perhaps some of the stories of churches, people you all have worked with. So Harry, why don't we begin with you?
Yeah, the action part really is more than just what you do. It's really focused on measuring your communication style more than anything else on the CQ assessment. So when it talks about action, it's really talking about the act of communicating, because it measures, the stuff, how you view yourself and others in terms of how direct or indirect you are. It helps you understand whether or not you recognize when somebody's, using their body language and trying to speak beyond just their words. And so there's lots of nuances with regard to that action score. But in terms of your question, yeah, there's been lots of great examples of organizations, people who have used CQ, have seen the kinds of divides that it kind of shows, and then have worked really hard to bridge those divides. And so I can think of one very good example where a university saw there was a wide separation between the executive staff and the students on this one particular value with regard to, especially, well, it's the one on rules and rule keeping and rule bending. And, that plays very significantly when you're talking about doctrine, when you're talking about rules and handbooks, especially at a Christian university, when you got to sign those community covenants and there's just a broader sense of what to do and what not to do. But in order to help bridge that gap, what one person did, who is just a really high CQ person within the university, he started a dinner club where the people who joined had to commit to coming once a month. And then they would read a controversial book, and over dinner, you would have a mix of executive staff, faculty, and students talking about these complex issues. And he particularly chose controversial books to read because he didn't want to, he wanted to help that conversation to continue. And it was very, very good for everybody because you just start seeing and feeling how others are seeing and feeling the same thing you are, but from such a greatly different perspective. And when I heard about that program, I just thought that is one of the best things I've seen so far, because that's a very big generational gap that's happening across most of the Christian universities in North America.
Mm. Marcus, what about you? What are some, I don't want to call them success stories, but when you've seen organization and individuals turn action, knowledge, or drive knowledge strategy into action, what's been a story or two that you could share?
Yeah, I was thinking about some of the ways we get called in occasionally, and I'm sure this happens to you guys as well, is people who are trying to start churches or have churches, and they're trying to build their, diversity amongst the staff and leadership and whatnot. Conflict comes, right? And so you have to come in, and sometimes you're brought in to kind of mediate that conflict. And I remember last year I went into a church and there was a cultural conflict, and as you try to engage that, you find that it, again, like any conflict, it takes two to kind of make those changes in the way that they communicate. And so I remember I was trying to help them see, like, okay, so cultural value wise, this is what you're bringing in, and this is why you say like that, and this is why you say like that, and they couldn't get it, and so it ended up in desolation. Like they couldn't make it work, and it's very frustrating. Actually, they were like, we don't even want you to come anymore, Marcus. Like we'll figure it out ourselves. I was like, okay, but then I think about just recently we had a very similar situation, a church plant that was happening. It was a black pastor who was having trouble with a white staff member, and to his credit, he was like, I wanted to fire this person, but I'm familiar with the work that you guys do with Threaded. I'm just wondering if there's a cultural thing. And so we had somebody from our team engage with them, mediating that conversation. And when they were able to see like the values, and there was a lot of power dynamics, like power context, and power, in the midst of that. They were able to see like when they say this, it just means something different. And so for our end, we were helping them translate just even the language that they were using, the body language that they were utilizing to help them to see how to do and to read those things differently, so that they weren't both offended in the midst of it. And it turned into a beautiful thing. Like they're working together, they're talking more about it, and the staff and bringing us in even more for some of those cultural intelligence engagements. And so I just love to see and this is what I think is one of the big pieces of it, right? Is like, if we don't get this understanding of these cultural values, we're just going to see churches that are with great hearts, wanting to be multi-ethnic, if you will, multicultural, not surviving for things that could be fixed by just doing assessments and starting to understand what communication looks like and how it's changing. And we can find that multiplication effort of a CQ, of a high CQ in an area, that the church can actually elevate and innovate, if you will, from a kingdom perspective in ways they never could in a homogenous way. But they won't do it if they don't have a high CQ, because they're just going to be sitting in conflict all the time. So it's great to be able to see when people actually take that seriously, put it into action, and then see it work itself out.
Yeah, as you're describing, conflict actually becomes the opportunity for us to grow in all of these areas in terms of relationship, the tension, as we mentioned earlier, Christ lifted up. The unity is in that tension. And when you run to that tension and run to that conflict versus from it, great things can happen again when people are humble like you. We had a situation here with our Hispanic community, and they took offense to an event that happened at the church. We were on the verge of losing all of them. And among other things, Harry and I went and called the leadership of the Hispanic community together, heard them, listened to them, their concerns, lots of tears. It's a very long story, but at the end of the day, we got down on our knees and went across 10 or 12 of them, Harry, and basically just washed their feet. We didn't say anything. We just washed their feet, demonstrated that humility that we want through this confusion, through this conflict and tension that arose. We want to serve you and be here for you. And it changed the entire dimension of our Hispanic and our work amongst our first gen Hispanics. Again, because you're leaning into conflict, not running from it, and letting that be a teaching moment for everyone involved. And particularly, as we all know, the leaders have to show that the accommodation, if you will, the understanding in this literal metaphor, get down on your knees to serve and bring it back together. A great picture of the African-American leader you talked about there, Marcus. Graham, over to you on action, stories or things that you've seen where leaning into the pursuit of cultural intelligence and understanding really brings people together, entire congregations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So one of the key things with action is it's all about your ability to adapt based on the situation, the context, the relationship, the conversation that you're part of. So one of the big things that people wrestle with action is they think, do I have to fundamentally change who I am in order to be effective in using CQ for ministry? So action really helps people because it says, no, you don't have to necessarily fundamentally change who you are. You have to be able to adapt appropriately based on the context you are in. And so that often takes a lot of pressure off people, at least initially, as they're thinking about how do I use CQ, because it really is focused on a lot of those tools and those aspects of communication that Harry was pointing to a few minutes ago. So there's been so many times in training scenarios where you're helping people to see aspects of the values around communication. It could be something like direct versus indirect communication. And you see people have that kind of like unlock moment where they look at each other and they say, oh, you're not trying to be evasive or not answer my questions. You're just an indirect communicator, and I'm more direct, and I just literally cannot understand where you're coming from and what you're trying to say. And so when you see those moments, then that's just such a powerful time for those participants in the workshops and the leaders we work with, because they're realizing, like, my personal preference isn't the only way to see the world. It's not the only way to communicate. It's not the only way to get things done. Just that moment of self-awareness for so many people is critical. And then with action, you say, okay, great. Now that you know that, how are you going to put it into practice? And we're always pushing build repetitions, right? So Marcus, you talked about being in the gym early, right? So much of this is you got to practice. You got to have people around you that you can trust to give you great feedback. You've got to just practice. You've got to put yourself out there a little bit, and you've got to lean into it. So there's going to be times where that humility is so important, because you'll try something and it will not work like you hoped. And you got to pick yourself back up and you got to go again, right? So that's kind of feeds right back to the motivational aspects. But those moments of learning that you can turn into moments of adaptation and then build repetition is key for action, and really key for building the whole CQ approach to ministry.
I love that. Thinking about the action, the adaptation, then you try something, you fail at it, or you win on a couple points, you lose on another, but you adapt, you learn, and you roll forward into all of that. Well, we're almost out of time, but Jay, I want you to speak to action as well. We've heard some stories, but I want to encourage you, or ask you, if you would, speak to the pastors that are watching this right now. They're listening to this podcast, they're watching it, they want to lean into building healthy multi-ethnic organizations for the sake of the gospel. And what action step or two, if you truncate this whole conversation, we've shared drive, knowledge. So how do we aggregate drive, knowledge, and strategy into some steps of action to the pastors listening right now? What would you say to them, Jay?
I think one of the things builds upon what Marcus said, which was to look at the diversity, both external and internal, within your church and start with becoming adaptable to hearing the ideas of the people that are in your church. Because if you cannot do it internally, you won't be able to do it externally.
Good.
One place to start that many of our churches are struggling with is to become more multi-generational and to draw more youth into the church. College age, once students' parents stop dragging them to church, then at the college age, oftentimes they will just stop going to church. And so to look at, what are things you could do multi-generationally, which has to do with listening to people from that generation and listening to what are the places they go to, what do they get out of those places, and what would they want to be able to get out of church if they could. So practice at home. Like they always say when you're ordained, your first ministry is your home. Well, your first CQ adventure is within your church to understand some of the diversity that is there, because people may not be as homogenous as you actually think they are, and creating a place where it's safe to have a dissenting opinion, where it's safe to disagree with a person, where you have a healthy way of dealing with conflict, I think is a good precursor to starting to try to expand outward, because it's nothing worse than expanding outward. And as Martin Luther King wrote in his poem, World House, and when he was thinking about beloved community, he started to wonder towards the end of his life, was he integrating his people into a burning house? I would say make sure your own house is thriving before you try to integrate other people into it.
That's so good. And Jay, earlier you expanded our understanding of diversity. When we're talking about even American South is very different than the Northwest, Pacific Northwest.
Yes.
And even as you're talking about here in terms of generational. So bloom where you're planted, so to speak. And if you're listening, planting, growing, developing a multi-ethnic church, you want to move into that space. Again, cutting your teeth, if you will, with the diversity, broadening your understanding of what that is, and then cutting your teeth at the local level. I did that in my student ministry. Prior to any of this in the multi-ethnic world, I came to a church in 1993 and about 150 kids, and I'd say 90% went to private schools and 10% public. And I always say I cut my teeth on bringing those students together. And that's, to your point, Jay, that was a diversity there. They were pretty much all white at that time, back in the 90s when I was doing that. But that was a very big divide, and learning to bridge that gap and bring them together, which we were able to do, thankfully, effectively. I always say it kind of cut my teeth. And Graham, you had that. I mean, you were in Ireland and you got the Catholics and Protestants, and maybe everybody is white, maybe everybody's Irish. I'm sure that's changed today. But same thing with you. What would you say to pastors and ministry leaders watching this? Just a simple action step you'd encourage them to take, as Jay and I were just talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I just think reiterating that point that people on the surface, quote unquote, may look the same, but really there's so much difference that's going on among people. And you see that in the assessment results. You keep coming back to the assessment, but the assessment results will show you what's happening in groups of people that might otherwise look very, very similar. And so it's such a powerful tool. When we're talking to ministry leaders about how to grow in CQ, we always come back to remain humble and remain curious. If you can keep those two postures, it will take you a long way on this journey. Yeah,
that's right. Marcus, what do you have to say to some of the pastors, leaders watching this in terms of next steps, or a step to aggregate the things we've talked about today?
Yeah, I'm always going to go back to the foundational piece. Like I'll say it, and it'll be, you got to get your theology in on this. You know what I mean? Like if you don't have the foundation that this is part of God's mission in the world, then you're not going to do it. But if you can ground all of this in the scriptures, then what happens is every time you go back to the scriptures, you're going to see something that's going to drive you to this again. Your preaching completely changes. As soon as you understand that God has been working on this from Genesis, like all the way to Revelation, as soon as you get your through line, your meta narrative, that you see this work, the mission of God is building this Revelation 7 church, and you can see it all the way through the Old Testament. You can see it in Jesus' life. You can see it in Paul's letters. You can see it in Pentecost, the book of Acts. Like it is all there. And all I know is that everybody who gets that, don't stop from a Christian standpoint. And then put yourself in proximity to somebody who is different than you, that you can say to them, not that you can say that they're your people are my people, kind of Ruth moment. Right? If you got your theology right and you got a proximity to somebody who you deeply love, that you consider your people, it don't stop you. You're going to keep going.
You brought me back to Antioch in the church, Acts 11, talking about the theology and all over Scripture. This is Barnabas going from the monoethnic, monocultural church of Jerusalem into what became the healthy multi-ethnic church at Antioch. When the brother gets up there, he never goes back. Once you see, you feel the men and women, Jews and Gentiles, rich and poor, walking, working, worshiping God together as one. You don't go back, you go forward. And again, you're reminding us that this is a biblical mandated theological vision, envisioned by Christ on the night before he died. Luke describes it at Antioch. Paul prescribes it throughout his life and writings. And even N.T. Wright, for some of you watching this with the exponential background, will appreciate that N.T. Wright in November released a book on the book of Ephesians, in which he says from his perch as a well-known theologian that this is essentially what Paul gave his life to, was building churches for all people, not just some. And so, Harry, we'll bring it all the way back to you for kind of final word, encouragement to pastors, ministry leaders watching as we think about next steps, putting into practice and action some of the things they've heard or are on their hearts today related to cultural intelligence.
Yeah, I would really encourage them all to make CQ part of your discipleship and part of your sanctification process. I mean, the CQ assessment is just a framework. It's nothing spiritual about it. It's amoral. It's just a simple way for you to have another tool in your tool belt. But the part that you grow in and make it part of who you are and make it help you fulfill your calling is really critical. And if you look at the life of Paul, of course, he's the one that really modeled this for us, because he basically said, even though I'm free from all, I made myself a servant to all. He spent his entire life showing us what it meant to serve all people. And I'm convinced that you can serve all people, but if you have CQ and can serve all people, it will multiply your spiritual effectiveness as you learn how to love others well in ways that you never even knew that's the way, they wanted to be loved, or the way that you even knew how to love. But in reality, those kinds of action steps to get you to be that kind of person will require a lot of sacrifice on your part, just like it did for Paul.
Well, again, we've talked about cultural intelligence, the general topic, the importance of that, and then we've leaned a lot into the CQ assessment developed by Dave Livermore and the folks at the Cultural Intelligence Center over the past 25 years. And if you're listening or watching this and you're interested in that assessment, Mosaix offers that, Threaded offers that. All four of these folks on here, we're connected, we're in relationship. And the easiest way is just get in touch with us. You can find bios and links on the Exponential Next, Multi-Ethnic Church Next website. But let us know. It's a simple tool. I know that, Harry, we've worked with, real quick, Threaded. Marcus, tell them about your stats. I mean, Harry, I know we're well over 100 organizations, 4,200 assessments, very adept at that. Marcus, what about you over Threaded? You work with tons of places as well in this space.
Yeah, we're not as, we've learned from you. So we're at the dozens, if you will. And so, but we're having a good time. But we tend to drop in on churches in a long sort of maybe 3-year roadmap with them. And so the CQ is like right at the top. If we're going to move people toward ultimately being moving towards a movement of cross-cultural collaborative community action is what we do. And so it's one of the places along our roadmap that we have to do on the way. So we love doing it, and we love to work with anybody who's trying to move that direction.
Yeah, well, again, through Mosaix, through Threaded, through the relationships of individuals that are on here with Graham and Jaye, we can provide that in different contexts and different people. So let us know if you're interested in a CQ assessment and training session for your staff or your church. We typically work with the leadership and the staff or organizations, universities, nonprofits, all of that's in play. And Graham, I should say as well that we are having you saw my magic wave there, I think, my light went off. But we are actually launching at the Billy Graham Center this year a non-credit bearing certificate in cultural intelligence coming out sometime in 2026 through the Mosaix Institute at the Billy Graham Center. So that's another place you can get it. Well, let me just wrap it up, say thank you to my guests today, to each one of you, to Harry, Graham, Jay, Marcus. Thanks so much for joining us. For all of you listening, of course, Exponential Global in March of 2026, as well as regionals coming up. But all things Exponential are designed to help us multiply churches that are healthy and effective on earth as it is in heaven, to advance a credible gospel in an increasingly diverse society. It's been my pleasure to be with you today. Again, thanks to all of you for joining us, and check us out at these places. Multiethnic Next, part of the Exponential Next family. I'll talk to you soon.